Good evening. It's good to be with you tonight. Had another beautiful day. I think the weather is cooling off. It's probably going to start raining again. And we'll be like Miyagi in that show back in the 80s, wax on, wax off. It's like your coat on, your coat off. That's what happens in Georgia when you come to the weather. You never know from one minute to the next. So I think it's going to be cold tomorrow. I don't know. But it's going to be rainy. But we're thankful for the beautiful days we've had and the beautiful pollen that's covered everything, yellow, that's making us hoarse. And so we're just very grateful for all those good things that we experience every year where pine trees grow. Remember last week we were looking at Genesis 10 and 11, and in those two chapters, especially in chapter 11, the primary emphasis was on all of humanity and what was happening after the days of the flood, after those sons that came from the ark, and what they did, what their children did. And we looked at an individual named Nimrod. Josephus suggests to us that this was the individual who led the construction effort in what we call the Tower of Babel. It actually was a city, and we were basically making the point last week that even if it was not this particular Nimrod that's named, by the way, in the text, nevertheless we can use the expression to refer to a philosophy or a worldview, one which envisions all of humanity under one government, all of humanity under one man-made government. And I believe that's what we see in Nimrod, that spirit of unity, so-called. And again, I think it's important that we take a moment and we recognize that unity is always desirable, but not unity in the absolute sense. And we're going to say quite a bit about that in the next few minutes. Why God would not want such unity. He does want us to be united, but not in this way, and I want to say more about that in a moment. But as we were looking at the Tower of Babel, we were looking at the rebellion against God. We noted that, of course, with that kind of man-made government, the natural outcome or the natural outgrowth or expression of it is tyranny. It's, of course, whoever's in charge. They have the guns, they have the police force or the military or whatever, and they call the shots, and they tell everyone what they will or will not do, how they will or will not live, what is acceptable and not acceptable, and you have no say in the matter. You're not free in such an arrangement. It is sad to note that worldwide, not just here, but in many advanced industrialized nations around the world, where the elites are in charge, and they're in charge in most places around the world, they are envisioning a new world order. And you hear a lot about that. You hear about this idea that we should all bring the United Nations together. We should all work together under one world government. Well, that's really the spirit of Nimrod, isn't it? It would seem like we're going right back to where God had said, that's not acceptable. I don't want you, my people, my creatures, to do that. I want you to spread out. I want you to spread the misery or the good times or whatever. I want you to spread it out. I don't want you to make it all under one umbrella. When you look at, again, the founding of this nation, one of the things, and this is where we're rushing through last week, so I want to kind of just repeat some of the things we looked at, but I do want to drive this point home, that the United States of America is a very unique experience. When I say unique, I don't just mean by that we're unique among the nations of the world present tense. That's still pretty much the case. But historically speaking, the expression that we see in our Bill of Rights, in our Constitution, the way our republic was initially established, it is a very unique approach that grants us really unprecedented freedoms. The kind of freedoms most people think about, dream about, wish were the case. Well, we've had those freedoms. We're losing those freedoms, rapidly losing those freedoms. But I suggest to you that the reason these freedoms were able to be implemented, they're God-given freedoms, by the way, and the founders recognized this is a God-given right. And so the original founders, who saw themselves as the architects of this new and unique approach to this republic, they thought of themselves as doing what God would naturally incline human beings to do, that is, to be free. But the question would arise, how can people be free without government constraint? How can we have a government that allows people freedom? Well, they were operating from a Christian world view, not Judeo. We hear that a lot. They weren't working from a Jewish Christian perspective. They were working from strictly a Christian perspective, not a Catholic perspective, a Christian perspective. They saw the New Testament, the gospel of Christ, as the basis, principally speaking, for our republic. And they made no bones about it. They were very clear in what they thought. And it was their understanding that we can have such God-given freedoms as long as the population continues to maintain consistently this worldview. We consistently read the Bible. We consistently go to church. We consistently live our lives in keeping with the moral code found in Scripture. If we do that, then we don't need a strong government to constrain us, to prevent us from doing unthinkable things, because we will control ourselves. That was their thinking. I just give you, again, the quote that we shared with you last week from Jedediah Morse. The foundations, he said, would support the interest of Christianity are also necessary to support a free and equal government like our own. And of course, he goes on to compare what we're doing here with the other nations of the world where Christianity doesn't reign supreme. And he, of course, is bemoaning the fact that those other nations don't have the kind of freedom we do. They can't have them because they're not equipped to have such freedoms. And so, again, this is something unique to the American experience. He goes on to say, to the kindly influence of Christianity, we owe that degree of civil freedom and political and social happiness which mankind now enjoy. Then he adds this thought, in proportion as the genuine effects of Christianity are diminished in any nation, either through unbelief or the corruption of its doctrines or the neglect of its institutions, in the same proportion will the people of that nation receive from the blessings of genuine freedom and approximate the miseries of complete despotism. So again, the more Christianity is exalted and the more Christianity is understood to be in the mainstream, then the more likely we are to maintain our freedoms. But when we diminish the Christian voice, we diminish the Christian influence, in proportion, we're going to see despotism, tyranny. We're going to see a stronger government and more constraint on our freedom of speech, among other things, perhaps our freedom of assembly, a lot of freedoms that you just have grown up assuming are yours, and they are God-given rights, but they're only guaranteed to a citizenry that really governs itself because they are subject to the law of Christ. And I'm putting it simply, but that's literally how the founders envisioned this republic. It's tragic that today an entire generation is coming along that doesn't seem to understand this whatsoever. And fewer are in any way inclined to be religious or to attend a church or to read their Bible or to call themselves Christians. There's an increasing percentage of Americans that are more than willing to say, I don't have anything to do with Christianity, know nothing about it. That is a tragic development in our society. It must be reversed. But again, George Washington said the same thing: of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. So again, just look at the way he's reasoning. You claim to be a patriot. Well, if you are a patriot, you should be, in proportion to that, a devout Christian. That's what he's saying. And if you don't support Christianity, you don't support the Bible, the reading of it, the living according to it, well, then you're not a real patriot. Now, where we are today is vastly different than where we were when this republic was first established. That's sad. That is a great tragedy. I don't believe that it's over and done. I do believe it's really very difficult to turn this ship around, but I do believe that it's possible to see a wholesale revival again if God's people will do what God has called us to do and preach and share and live the gospel. I do believe it's possible, but it must begin with us. We must begin to herald this message of freedom. And again, you think, where does this come from? Genesis 11. I'm sorry, but it does. It comes from Genesis 11. We need to understand in practical terms what these Old Testament events mean to us. And it certainly exposes the folly of man-made government, separate and apart, devoid from God, as we were noticing last week. Nimrod and his spirit was one, according to Josephus. That sound very much like the humanists of our day. We don't need God. We don't care for God. We're going to do things our own way. We're going to pull ourselves up by our own bootstrap. We don't need to depend on God. We need God for everything. In him we live and move and have our being, Paul said to the Athenians. That's true. If it weren't for him, we wouldn't be alive. So we thank God every day for the blessing of life itself and for the means of supporting our lives. Now, I want to take a moment here to share with you a thought of mine I've had for quite a while. You may disagree with me, and that's okay, but when you look at what happens in Genesis 11, God saw that everyone spoke the same language. They were all gathering together in the valley of Shinar, and they're building this city and this tower, and they're going to make a name for themselves. And God was not pleased with that. So God confounded their languages. God divided them. He divided the world. In the days of Peleg, remember, the earth was divided. And so this was God's plan. And again, Paul referenced that, I believe, in Acts 17, the bounds of their habitation. Again, that's a reference, I believe, to God dividing the globe up the way he intended for it to be divided. But I want you to think about this principle that manifests itself in a variety of ways. And it suggests something, I believe, about God's will for us. When Israel came into the land of Canaan and conquered it, where was their king and where was his throne? The answer is heaven, and God was their king. Now, they had a place of worship. It was in Shiloh. 350 years, the worship of Israel was at Shiloh. There was a common view, a worldview. They believed in the one true God. They worked together, and we see that in the book of Judges. There were times when tribes would work together to overcome outside threats or whatever. They did work together, sometimes even to punish other tribes, like when Benjamin was almost annihilated because of their grotesque behavior. The other tribes gathered together and they made them, almost destroyed them, but then made them back again. So they worked together in a confederation of tribes, literally. When the people of Israel, the elders, came to Samuel, the prophet, many years later and said, "We want to have a king like the other nations." What did Samuel do? What was his response? Well, he cried all night. And God heard his cry, and God responded to Samuel. And he said, "They've not rejected you. They rejected me, that I should rule over them." You see, God's vision was these 12 or 10 and a half, 11 different categories of tribes that were spread around. Of course, the people of the Levites were spread all over. So again, if you look at it in that light, this was God's will, that they be loosely together, working together when need be, but separate tribes. But when you unite them together in one kingdom, what happens? Well, you have about, 120 years, is that right? 120 years of a united kingdom. And after that, it did what? It split in two. And so we have 10 northern tribes, and we have the other tribes, the two tribes in the south, or 1.5, however you count them. But again, we have basically that division. We're all recognized, Israel and Judah. Again, God's will. God willed it. Why? Because of the apostasy that was already taking place with the leadership in Israel, the northern tribes. My point is this. I read this concept many years ago. And I want to say this charitably, and I mean it charitably. I don't mean any disrespect at all when I use this expression. I don't know how else to say it. But we have in our brotherhood what we call sometimes the anti-wing of the brotherhood, and I don't mean that in a derogatory or negative way. I'm just saying that so you understand where I got this literature. You'll know who I'm reading. And the question was uninspired literature in Bible classes. And I found it interesting. I was reading an uninspired book about uninspired literature being taught in Bible classes. But again, I didn't agree with everything they said. However, there was a very powerful point made. Of course, I don't know that I agree with the way they were going about making their point, but it's a valid concept. And their idea was if all the churches around the nation, around the world, are, let's say, drinking from the fountain of the Gospel Advocate Quarterly, and we're all using the Gospel Advocate Quarterly, what happens if false teaching gets injected in the Gospel Advocate Quarterly? Well, it just spreads like a cancer everywhere. You know, that's not really an invalid concern. It's one we should all be aware of, and we should all be concerned of. If you poison a single fountain that everybody's drinking from, everybody's going to get sick. I think this is what I'm saying here about God and his plan for mankind. I don't believe God ever intended for us to all be lumped together. Clearly, Genesis 11 says no. I believe when Israel came into the land of Canaan, the answer again was no. When you study the book of Revelation and you see where Jesus is walking among the 7 churches, were those churches united together under one bishop who was ruling in that district, who told all those churches what? No, there was Jesus walking among the churches. Some of them were in good standing. Some of them were on the verge of apostasy. Some of them were about to have their name blotted out. But I mean, again, he's dealing with them on an individual basis. Why do you suppose God set the church up the way he did? Well, let's say we have one universal Catholic church. Let's just suppose that. And let's suppose that the Pope, he loses his mind and he decides to go crazy and he starts invoking all kind of crazy ideas and concepts. Well, everybody around the world, if they're obedient Catholics, what are they going to do? They're going to follow this crazy Pope and they're going to believe that the sky's green when it actually looks blue when you look at it. But they're going to believe that because that's what he said. And so if everybody's drinking from the same fountain, they're going to be poisoned. I think there's a good point to be made here about autonomy of churches. I think there's a good point to be made about states' rights. Again, we lost that war, by the way, in the 1860s. But I do believe the founders envisioned the United States of America. We don't have a United States. We have an America. And we have federal government that tells the states what to do. And if you don't believe that, well, I'm sorry, you're not paying attention. But we fly our flag under the federal flag because we're now moving again in that direction. It's getting even worse. It's growing in proportion. Again, I just think it's important for us to see these principles, to understand these principles, to be able to enunciate these principles so that we can avoid this Nimrod philosophy, this spirit of rebellion that God certainly cared nothing for on the plains of Shinar. Any questions or comments about chapters 10 and 11? All right. Well, chapter 12. Remember the last section of chapter 11, we have the genealogy of Terah, and of course the name that stands out is Abram. Chapter 12, now the Lord had said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Then Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan. By the way, this little statement the people they had acquired, it's a vast army, by the way. And you're going to see that as you continue reading. He's already a very wealthy man, and he's going to get wealthier and wealthier as we proceed. So Abram passed through the land of the place of Shechem as far as the terebinth tree of Moreh, and the Canaanites were then in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your descendants I will give this land." And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. And he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. So Abram journeyed, going on still toward the south. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. It came to pass, when he was close to entering Egypt, that he said to Sarai his wife, "Indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. Therefore, it will happen when the Egyptians see you that they will say, 'This is his wife,' and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you." So it was when Abram came into Egypt that the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful. The princes of Pharaoh also saw her and commended her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. He treated Abram well for her sake. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this that you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister? I might have taken her as my wife. Now therefore, here is your wife. Take her and go your way." So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. Okay. So we are moving in our focus from all of humanity to a single individual, and this single individual is reminding us and highlighting God's one plan to save sinful humanity. In Ephesians 3, verses 8 through 11, does someone want to read that or quote that for me very quickly? What Paul said there about this plan? Anyone have that?
3, 8 through 11.
Yes.
Unto me, who am less than the least of all saints, is this grace given, that I should preach among the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ, and to make all men see what is the fellowship of the mystery, which from the beginning of the world hath been hid in God, who created all things by Jesus Christ, to the intent that now unto the principalities and powers in heavenly places might be known by the church the manifold wisdom of God.
So these principalities and powers in heavenly places are seeing what? What are they seeing in the church? They're seeing God's plan. It was in God's mind since when? Before the foundation of the world. So I think it's important that we understand when we read the book of Genesis or any book in the Bible, but beginning of Genesis, the book of beginnings, we understand that there's this plan and it's unfolding. And so these things that we're reading, they're interesting, and we certainly learn a great deal from them about a variety of subjects, but there is one continuous scarlet thread that runs from Genesis 3:15 all the way to the birth of Jesus. And it's evident, especially when you come to someone like Abram. And I want to talk to you about Abram and who exactly he was. Again, we noted last week, Abram was not the only person on planet Earth that believed in the one true God. In fact, there was someone greater than Abraham when he met this other individual. And we know he was greater because the Hebrew writer tells us he was greater than Abram. And Abram acknowledged his greatness over him by giving him a tithe of all that he had. And so Melchizedek was greater than Abram. So who was Melchizedek? Why did God not choose him? I don't know the answer to that question. I couldn't tell you. I can only ask, who was Abraham? You know, Jews, Muslims, Christians, people around the world from a variety of worldviews and cultures, they all know about and they talk about and they memorialize this man Abram. Now, God called him his friend. Of course, Jesus said we're his friends if we do whatever he commands us. But Abraham got the article the friend of God. Not a friend, the friend. Why God chose him, we could speculate, and I do want to speculate some. I would suggest first and foremost, he was chosen because of his faith. Obviously, because of his faith. In fact, he's the father of the faithful. He's the father of those of faith. And so we recognize this, we understand this. There are other reasons we could say that God chose Abram. In Genesis chapter 18, beginning around verse 17, God is, of course, discussing there about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. But in that discussion, he talks about Abraham and his children. And God acknowledged that Abraham would teach his children the true knowledge of God. One thing you could say about the Hebrew people is that they, for over many centuries, maintained understanding and a knowledge of the one true and living God. Abraham did exactly that. God knew he would be the man for the job. And there's something to be said about that, particularly today. I was visiting with Sister Adair just a moment ago in the hospital, and I saw her son, Tim. He was there, and we were just having a conversation, and I don't know why. I have no idea why he brought up politics, but he did. I'm talking to his mother. And anyway, he was saying something about my shirt, and I said, okay, well, fine, whatever. But then we got on to politics, and he started saying, we've really got a mess in public school today. I said, no, you're right. He said, they're really just government institutions to propagandize and destroy the minds and hearts of our young people. I said, well, you're right about that. But, we don't really need to worry about that if, as parents, we're doing our job. I mean, parents have more influence over their children than anyone else. We just don't always utilize that influence. We don't take the time to exercise that influence. God told fathers to teach your children, raise them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. That's the duty of fathers. Mothers are to teach their girls, their young girls, to love their husbands, to be homemakers, to be obedient to their husbands. All of these things are taught and handed down. Abraham certainly is a case in point there, and a lesson for all of us. Yes, we do live in a world that is intent on robbing our children out from under us, stealing their hearts, warping their minds, changing their worldview, and they're having great success, by the way. But as parents, we really have the advantage. That's why you hear more about, well, we got to get more children in school sooner. So we have kindergarten, now we got pre-K, then we got pre-KK, and what the government wants is just have the baby, feed the baby, and give it to us, and we'll teach the baby what we want, when we want it to walk, when we want to talk, what we want to say, the language we want to use. They want everything. They want you to foot the bill, but they want to take your child's brain and heart and mold it into their godless image. That's literally what's happening, because the spirit of Nimrod is alive and active. I know you think I sound crazy, but I'm just stating a fact. This is the world we live in. Abraham lived in a similar world. He realized he was in a hostile environment. When he built an altar in the land of Canaan, that was a rather outrageous thing for him to do, because the Canaanites were then in the land. They were idolaters. Here he is building an altar to who? The one true God. So he's making a statement, isn't he? Everywhere he went, he was making a statement. He was making a stand, and he did so with his children. So I think you could argue that Abraham was chosen because God knew, and he said it in chapter 17, or 18 rather. He said, I know he will teach his children. And that would be grand if God could say that of every parent. I know they'll teach their children. And you don't teach your children by giving them an iPad. Sorry, that doesn't happen. You don't teach your children by giving them the remote control, say, watch TV, shut up, leave me alone, I'm busy. You don't teach your children that way. That's not how your children learn. Just saying, we need to take the time, put in the effort, and teach our children. Now, he's called the father of the faith. Now, I want to read something to you in the book of Romans, because that idea is found here. Paul is, of course, discussing the basis of our justification, and he's answering in this whole discussion the Jews and their concept of salvation based on the law and circumcision. They couldn't conceive of salvation apart from circumcision and keeping the law of Moses. It was just too much for them to get their minds around. They had grown up in a world taught where if you're not circumcised, you're not part of the covenant, you're outside of the covenant, you're without God, without hope. I mean, that's just their view. And for a lot of good reasons, that would be the case. But again, they put a lot of emphasis on circumcision, but the law of Moses. And so Paul begins talking about Abraham in chapter 4. He talks about how Abraham was justified by faith, but not by the deeds of the law. And you say, well, what law is he talking about? Well, there's no question what law he's talking about, especially when you get, let's say, verse 9 of chapter 4. He asked this question. He talks about David in the Psalm, who talks about the blessedness of those whose sins are forgiven. He said, does this blessedness then come upon the circumcised only, or upon the uncircumcised also? For we say that faith was accounted to Abraham for righteousness. How then was it accounted? While he was circumcised or uncircumcised? And then Paul answers himself, not while circumcised, but while uncircumcised. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had while still uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all those who believe, though they are uncircumcised, that righteousness might be imputed to them also, and the father of circumcision to those who not only are of the circumcision, but who also walk in the steps of the faith which our father Abraham had while still uncircumcised. For the promise that he would be the heir of the world was not Abraham to receive through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. Now again, understand what he's arguing here. These Jews put all emphasis on circumcision. And they talked about Abraham. Abraham is our father. Remember what John the Baptist said to those Jews that came to his baptism. Don't say to yourself, Abraham is our father. God could take these stones, raise up children of Abraham. But they thought of themselves, we're children of Abraham. Jesus said they were children of the devil. But they said, we're children of Abraham. And so we're circumcised. We're in the covenant. We're good to go. But notice what he's pointing out here. Abraham was justified how many years before the law of Moses? 400 plus years. 4 centuries prior to the law of Moses. Abraham, your father, the guy you brag about, the guy you say, hey, look, he's the guy that proves we're the children of God, and because we're children of Abraham, well, he was justified and the law didn't even exist. And not only that, he was justified before he was circumcised. That's fascinating. So before Abraham was ever circumcised, by the way, Ishmael was 13 before he was circumcised, and Abraham was 100 years old when he was circumcised. So, I mean, Abraham lived most of his life, or the better part of his life, uncircumcised. And it's fascinating because he's here called the father of all who believe, of the circumcised and the uncircumcised, meaning Jews and Gentiles, all classes of people, all families of the earth. So again, he's a father of faith. But again, notice the phrase here, those who walk in the footsteps of Abraham. That's fascinating. Now in Ephesians 5, we're told to, like children, we follow our Father in heaven, like children who follow their father's footsteps. We follow him in love, right? That's what Ephesians 5 is teaching us in the first few verses. But here we're called the children of Abraham, and we're following in his footsteps. There's something significant about this man. He wasn't the only man of faith in the world in his time, but he was chosen by God, and probably for a variety of reasons. One of the things I want to say about Abraham, we talk about how he would, or his descendant, and I'm going to say it that way by design because, again, the Jews missed that. They thought, well, the Jewish people, the seeds of Abraham. They blessed the world. That's not what God said. He said through your seed, singular. So in the book of Galatians, Paul made a lengthy argument. He didn't say, and of seeds, plural, but of your seed, singular. One Jew. And that one Jew we know is Jesus of Nazareth. So he's the one, of course, that blesses all the families of the earth ultimately. But God said, I'm going to bless you. But God also said, you will be a blessing. If we are children of Abraham, will we not, following in his footsteps, will we not be a blessing? How could we bless other people? How do we bless people? Can you think of anything? Love people, okay. Show them what love is, all right. That's one way, yeah. Teach them the gospel, yeah. Love people. I like that. That summarizes a lot. I mean, love them. Teach them. You know, what's that? Give to them. Well, we are to work, laboring with our hands, so we can have a lot when we retire. That's what the Bible teaches, right? What, I missed that? We're working with our hands that we might do what? Provide to those in need. So we are a blessing, are we not? Do we not feed people when they're hungry and clothe them when they're naked? Is that not what we'll be judged on? Matthew 25? I guess that's what Jesus said. I mean, how can we question that? So, yeah, we are a blessing. We show people love. We show them an example. An example of what it is to be a human being. What would God expect husbands and mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters and neighbors and workers, co-workers? What would God expect of those people? God's people should be able to show the world what God expects of us to do, so that people look at us and say, you know, I wish I were more like those people. I wish I were more like those people. I want to be like that. I want to live my life that way. I want to be happy like they are. I want to be fulfilled like they are. I want to be joy-filled like they are. I want that. Whatever they've got, I want it. That's the kind of blessing, and then some, and we don't have time to go into all of that. But again, isn't it fascinating? God said, you will be a blessing, and he was, and he is, and so are we, because we are children of Abraham. Okay, so God called Abram, or Abraham. He's here, Abram, in chapter 12. God hadn't changed his name yet. But verse 1 of chapter 12, God had said to Abram. Now, it's not evident in our reading in Genesis 12, but Stephen does make it clear for us. And I want to make this point, and this is probably the last point I can get across with the time we have left. In Acts chapter 7, verse 2, in that powerful sermon that Stephen preached, he said, brethren and fathers, listen. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran, and said to him, get out of your country and from your relatives, and to come to a land that I will show you. He came out of the land of the Chaldeans and dwelt in Haran. And from there, when his father was dead, he moved him to this land in which you now dwell. That's interesting, isn't it? God told him, he didn't just tell him to leave your home. He said, do what else? Leave your family and your father and your relatives. What did we just read here, by the way, in chapter 12? He took with him his nephew, right? Nephew was not a great man. He was a righteous man in relation to the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. That's not saying much. But again, they were separated, and for a reason. But it only happened eventually. I'm getting ahead of myself, but why would God say, leave your father and your relatives? And why would he wait until his father died in Haran? That's a good question. In Joshua 24, Joshua said to all the people, thus said the Lord God of Israel, your fathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, dwelt on the other side of the river in old times, and they served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham from the other side of the river, led him throughout all the land of Canaan, and multiplied the descendants, and gave him Isaac. Well, I believe Joshua just answered the question. Why would God say to Abraham, get away from your father and from your relatives? Why? Because they're idolaters. Now, in Ur of the Chaldees, they worshiped the same God that was worshipped in Haran. So his father had no problem going with him to Haran, but Abraham stayed in Haran until his father died. And then he migrated south. And that's where we pick up in chapter 12. So God had said it once, and now he's saying it a second time, but he's not changing his message. He's saying the same thing. Leave your father and your brothers. Now, in Hebrews 11, we read that by faith Abraham, when he was called to go to the place which he would receive as an inheritance, he obeyed, and he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith he dwelt in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heir with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. If you're like me, you're probably wondering, how do you put all this together? Because God told Abraham to do this. The Hebrew writer said he did what God told him to. He obeyed God. But the Hebrew writer, I think, was specific when he said when he was told to leave, he left. He did that. But it doesn't seem that he did everything initially that God told him to do. It seemed like, just looking at the text, comparing notes here, it was a process. It took time. And it took more than one time for God to tell him the same thing. Now, I don't know about you, I find comfort in that. Because Abraham was a man of faith, right? He did what God told him to do. You know, when you obey the gospel, I don't know of many people that I've ever baptized that came up from the grave of baptism. They knew already. There were so many things, so many changes that are going to have to take place in their life, and they know that. But those changes don't always just happen with the snap of a finger. Now, you've changed your mind about a lot of practices and ideas and things, but it takes time sometimes to untangle yourself from the web that we've woven in the life that we've led, and we have to kind of work our way out of it. Aren't you thankful that God is merciful and long-suffering? I want to say more about that, because God did tell Abraham a second time at least to do this very thing. In Luke 13, verse 6, Jesus spoke this parable. A certain man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came seeking fruit on it and found none. He said to the keeper of his vineyard, look, for 3 years I have come seeking fruit on this fig tree and find none. Cut it down. Why does it use up the ground? But he answers him, sir, let it alone this year also, until I dig around it and fertilize it, and if it bears fruit, well, but if not, after that you can cut it down. Wow. What do you learn in this parable? What are you learning about God? What are you learning specifically about Jesus? I mean, you came up from the grave of baptism. You ought to be out there winning souls for Christ immediately, living a clean Christian life, doing everything. Well, you know, that's what you want. That's what you're striving to do. But you know, there are a lot of things you got to learn. A lot of things you got to experience. It just takes time. Aren't you thankful that God gives us time to get it right? And why did he wait for his father to die? I don't know. But God told him, leave your father. He did. He waited for him to die, and then he left him. Well, he did, so of course he's going to leave him. But then he takes Lot with him. Now, you know, we say, you know, we're getting ahead of ourselves because this comes up later. But Lot made some really bad choices. All right, one really serious bad choice. But I think reflects his attitude and his character. And it was also, I think, a reminder of why, Abraham, you don't need to be hanging around with Lot. He's not the same, he's not cut from the same cloth as you. He's a very different kind of person. And that's evident. And I don't want to get ahead of myself, but someone said the other day, Lot lost everything but his two daughters. I'm sorry, but when your two daughters get you drunk and they have sex with you and father children by you, I think it's fair to say you lost your daughters too. He lost everything. He lost everything. The Moabites, Ammonites were a continual thorn in the side of Israel because of this, but again, God saw this in Lot. Abraham needed to get away from that. It took him time. To the angel of the church in Thyatira, Revelation 2:18, write, these things says the Son of God, who has eyes like a flame of fire and his feet like fine brass. I know your works, love, service, faith, your patience, and as for your works, the last are more than the first. Nevertheless, I have a few things against you, because you allow that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, to teach and seduce my servants to commit sexual immorality and to eat things sacrificed to idols. I gave her time to repent of her sexual immorality, and she did not repent. Indeed, I will cast her into a sick bed, and those who commit adultery with her into great tribulation, unless they repent of their deeds. I will kill her children with death, and all the churches shall know that I am he who searches the hearts and minds, and I will give to each one according to your works. Wow. I gave her time. I gave her time to repent, and she didn't repent. Aren't you thankful that God gives us time? God works with us. God helps us. Now, we don't have time to get into the question of who are the children of Abraham, and hopefully we'll be able to do that next week. But any questions or comments before we're stampeded? Hey, I stopped on time, by the way, tonight. Oh, thanks. Wow. That's it, huh? Oh, okay. I'll go with that. Fine. Any questions or comments? By the way, I want to say for those watching on YouTube, a disclaimer here. People were yawning before I ever came up here tonight, so don't blame me. Number 479, please. 479 in your song books. It's in my notes. I'm not going to forget it. I will not. Thank you. Oh, by the way, I have an announcement. This is since last Wednesday till today, I've not watched the news. And I've slept better. And I'm happier. No, I don't know anything. Just be quiet, yeah. Yeah. And I'm not going to find out either. Nice try. 479 in your songbooks, please. No. Thank you. This world is not our home. Speaking of which, this coming Saturday at 11 a.m. at Jones Wynn Funeral Home, we'll be memorializing Sister Marie Early. And so all of us are invited to attend the service at the chapel there at 11 a.m. Visitation will begin at 10. So if you'd like to come and visit with the family, I certainly want to encourage you to do that. Don't forget the work day we have planned not for this Saturday, but for the next. We'll have a work day and cookout on that day, and in preparation for the gospel meeting, which begins Sunday week. That's that wonderful Georgia expression. So Sunday week, we'll start our meeting with Brandon Baggett, and we're looking forward to that. A better way is our theme, and so we're excited about that meeting. I hope you're excited and praying about this effort, and that you're planning to be here and you're planning to bring as many with you as you can. This is going to be a great opportunity to evangelize. Don't forget the family retreat that's being considered for 2024. If you have any interest or would like to have questions about it, see the sequence before you leave tonight. Joe Brown continues in the hospital. She is improving some, but her heart is still in AFib, and they're going to be shocking her heart Friday. And so she wants us to please pray, especially for her. I think she's dreading it, and so please remember her in your prayers. Diane Adair also was carried to the hospital. One's in emergency room 23, the other emergency room 25. Their rooms are literally back to back. The wall separates them. But Sister Adair was taken there today, low blood count, and they're testing her now to see what they need to do to help her. AJ is going to be seeing doctors and looking for treatment for his chronic condition. Please remember AJ in a very special way and for his treatment. Joanne Forbes continues to improve at home, but again, she said, I'm ready to get out. She's finding more energy, and she got a spring in her step, pardon the pun, and so she's excited to get out, and so please pray that she can do that sooner rather than later. Mildred, no change, I suppose, in her situation at all. Again, Angela's father had 2 stents put in yesterday. He's gone home, right? Is he still in the hospital? Okay. Well, I didn't know that. I thought he'd gone home. Well, what's that? He wanted to come home 3 days ago. Yeah, I know. Okay, well, we're glad that he got that stent and that hopefully he'll be able to improve with that. 479 has been announced as the song of invitation and encouragement. We were studying the life of Abraham, or the person of Abraham, in our class tonight, and we're looking at Romans chapter 4 and the basis for justification, and it really boils down to walking in the steps of the faith of Abraham. He's called the father of faith. He's the father of the faithful, that is, those who follow his example. And so the question would be, what is his example, and what kind of faith did he have? He had, simply put, an obedient faith. When God told him to leave, he left. When God told him to offer his son Isaac, he went intending to offer him. He did what God told him to do, even when it seemed beyond all human reason. He did whatever God said. He didn't stagger at the promises of God, but simply responded to what God said. That's the kind of faith it requires for an individual to be obedient to God today. When Jesus said, he that believes and is baptized shall be saved, when modern man said, I don't see any connection with baptism, you don't have to see a connection other than Jesus said, do it. And so when we do this, we're following in the footsteps of Abraham. We're simply obeying what Christ has commanded us to do. If that's your need tonight, and we can assist you, please make your need known right now while together we stand as we sing.